Imagine for a second there's an Excel sheet. An Excel sheet filled with years of information about watch collecting from a person that has a ton and has owned a ton of watches. Do you think you could learn something from that? Do you think there's something to just deep dive into because it's interesting? Well, I've got that Excel sheet. It's my Excel sheet. Let's just assume that there are 40 currently owned watches in the Excel sheet. With that number alone, there's a lot to learn. Now, assuming that you use all watches equally, then each watch will only get used 9 times per year. That's once for 9 months, and the rest of the year, it gathers dust. A big collection means there are watches that you hardly ever wear. The more you own, the less you're going to wear them. If you bought a $10,000 watch, that watch would average out in the first year to costing $1,111 every time you put it on the wrist, at least on average. To get that watch to $1 per use, you'd have to own it for 1,000 years, excluding service costs. Considering that an IWC perpetual calendar is accurate for about 45 million years, it's probably got a pretty good return on investment over time. You should get to $1 before 45 million years have gone by. If you bought a $20,000 watch, or even more 5 years ago, it would be costing you on average $450 per time you put it on your wrist in 2025. At the moment, your most expensive usage watch is a watch that you've had for more than a year, and it still costs you $850 every time you put it on. Right now, it's in your regular rotation, but it's gotten even more usage in 2025, so hopefully the cost will drop. No matter how you look at it, even your most used watch this year won't get to $1 per usage before you're likely dead. It's never going to be a cheap wear, and none of your watches are, except maybe for your Casios. Your most worn watch barely makes up 15% of the overall usage, and quite a few watches are getting used 1-2% of the time, so basically less than 6 days in a year. There is no scenario whatsoever where it gets cheap to own a lot of watches. Cost per wear remains high basically forever. It's a curve of diminishing returns, especially when you've got a lot of watches. In my case, almost all watches follow a curve of intense wear and then settle into a more regular cadence of use. My favorites get used 25 plus days per year. The core group gets 10 to 25 days used per year. And there's what I call the failed love group that usually ends up getting used less than 10 days per year. As a general rule of thumb, I already know if this is going to be a failed watch or a success of a watch. If a watch is below 10 usages per year in the second year, the watch is never going to be loved and it's on the list to be sold. So the question I always ask myself, and I suppose you could too, is 25 days a year enough for a watch that costs $1,000 or $5,000 or $50,000? I mean, only you know. There are 2 or 3 watches in the favorites that just never really change. Then there are a couple of elevator watches that move from the core group to the favorites and back again over time. My most worn watch has only been the most worn watch twice in a row in a 15-year period. 25% of my watches make up 75% of the usage. Logic dictates that a selection, for me at least, would be 8 to 12 watches. That would be the right size of a collection if the goal was to get the most usage out of all watches. There's no correlation whatsoever between watch price and how much a watch gets used. The 3 watches I've worn most over the last 5 years represent one of my most expensive watches, one of my absolute cheapest watches, and one bang in the middle. I've also got another Excel sheet, and I can tell from that Excel sheet that people subscribing is the best indicator of whether or not I'm making worthwhile videos. So I'm going to ask you to subscribe if you feel these videos are worth it. Servicing. With a collection of 40 watches, I fairly consistently have to plan for servicing 2 watches per year every single year. I have to budget for this. Since I'm not using my watches as much, overall the servicing needs are going to drop compared to what you would expect, but they're still there. I've also learned to take them to an AD or a watchmaker before they start exhibiting problems, because those problems almost always lead to higher repair costs. I have the AD do a quick accuracy check, they open the case, and if they say it's fine, then it probably is for a little bit longer. I know that on average, Rolexes are the ones that have the lowest servicing costs, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but this is because their service intervals overall are quite long, and I've learned that in general I can expect them to just not need as much servicing. I also know that Omega are a pretty close second when it comes to servicing. It's kind of obvious, but how much I use a watch massively impacts how much it needs servicing, unless it's a high horology watch. My Seikos don't get serviced at all, and it doesn't seem to make a difference. They are watches I've had for more than 10 years, and they're still accurate and functional and haven't been serviced yet. Sub $1,000 watches are sometimes, but not always, worth servicing. The price can, relatively speaking, be disproportionately high for the actual price of the watch. It's not the high horology watches that actually have the worst MSRP to repair cost ratio. It's the cheaper ones. Now back to the high horology thing. Anything from high horology is going to be finicky, it's going to be expensive to repair, and regardless of what they say, they need to be serviced more often than most mass-produced brands. My own personal experience tells me that JLC, which isn't quite high horology, or it can be, they are incredibly delicate watches and they cost a bundle to service every time. I would definitely say that if you're buying a watch over $15,000 and you don't have unlimited funds, I would build in a budget for servicing. High horology, and the higher up you go, it just takes ages to repair, it's expensive, and you wait a long time to get your watch back. That's also a thing. Apart from Rolex and Omega, pretty much any brand that leans on Sellita or classic ETA movements are going to be reasonably solid and super cheap to repair. I've only ever had 2 watches get magnetized. It was a JLC and a Seiko. My most expensive repair was a Breitling, but at the time I basically hadn't learned anything about it, so it was so banged up that it just needed basically everything replaced. I would again say never delay servicing. I've never cracked a sapphire crystal. Hesalite, you breathe on the thing and it just gets scratched and you kind of learn to enjoy it. As a general rule, I don't get the case polished. I've learned to appreciate the scratches and it saves me some money. Hollow end links can get super gunky, so clean your watches. Yeah, that's something I track as well. Value retention and pricing. For me, value retention as a concept is absurd. It's absurd because I'm always spending more than I'm ever going to earn on the watches. The whole point for me is to wear the watches. So sure, they represent value that I might be able to sell, but the fact is I've got no intention of selling them. Well, not initially at least. But when I do have a watch like the Rolex Explorer that I've spoken about before, and I've never used it, then it's a pleasant bonus that I was able to sell it above retail. Regardless of the watches I have, 90% of all my watches are now worth less than what I paid for them. I don't always get a discount, but when I do, it's almost always from an AD that I've got a stable and consistent relationship with. Over time, my collection and my buying habits have consistently gotten more expensive. This is partially a function of how my career has progressed, but the overall share of funds that I'm spending on watches has also gone up. I've just gotten more into the hobby. The point is, if you're anything like me and you're in this watch collecting hobby, just know it's probably only going to get more expensive over time. I'm buying fewer, but generally more expensive watches. Because my expensive watches sort of skew the sample size, but if I put them in 3 categories of expensive, mid, and low, then my favorite and most dominant price range is between $3,000 and $6,000. Data tells me I shouldn't bother to bring more than 1 watch on a vacation. There's one I'm always going to gravitate towards, and it's likely going to be the one on a steel bracelet. It's good for me to bring a rubber strap because I know it's more comfy, it's good for swimming, and if you sweat a lot or it's somewhere hot, then it's just good to have. Generally, I would probably advise myself not to go on vacation because I always end up buying watches on longer vacations, especially if I go to Italy. For some reason, Italy is expensive when it comes to watches because that's where I end up buying them. So I would save money by not ever going to Italy. I categorize my watches in 4 buckets. So I've got my luxury watches, which are gold and complications. Then I've got dress watches, smart and all-round watches, and casual watches. I've got by far the most casual watches, but it's the smart or all-round sort of Aquaterra style watches that get the most use. I hardly ever wear my dress watches. Blue dials and black dials dominate my collection, but I've got a ton of other colors and styles as well. When it comes to sizing, 40 to 43 millimeters gets by far the most wear time. When push comes to shove, smaller watches are more worn by me than really big watches. I also track leather straps and NATOs and how often they get used. Leather doesn't get used that much, so they were kind of wasted money on. NATO straps get used a lot, but I kind of default to black, army green, sometimes navy with a center line. So I've got these 40 watches, but every year, on average, I consider somewhere between 5 and 10 new watches. Over the 20 years that I've had the Excel sheet, I've considered 180 different watches to varying degrees. Most of them are quickly forgotten and never, ever, ever make the cut. And the more I collect, the fewer watches I actively consider. There's a clear statistical correlation between the time that went from when I first noted the watch down as a possible option to when I bought it and how much use it actually ends up getting. The longer I wait, the more I use it and the longer it stays in my collection. Also, there's no correlation between the price of the watch and the time it takes me to make up my mind. I essentially spend the same amount of time deciding on a $20,000 watch as I do on a $200 watch. Seiko is my most popular brand, but they don't quite ever make it into the most worn category. They're almost always in this 10 to 25 core group, more often than not. So far, I already know about 1 month in that my new Zenith is probably going to be in the top 4 of usages this year. Other things that are interesting to note. The watches that I bought at ADs and not online or through a grey dealer get worn more, and they stay in my collection much longer as a result. I think it's down to the fact that I've tried the watch more before buying it, and going to a grey dealer or going online just might mean that I've had less hands-on before buying. So my suggestion to other people, if it's anything like me, is get your hands on that watch before you buy it. It's going to lead to better buying decisions. It does, at least for me. My most expensive mistake was a Lange Saxonia. I paid, give or take, 20,000 euros for it, and I wore it 14 times. So I sold it for 17,000 euros after a year and a half. That equates to renting the watch at about 214 euros, $250 per use. Beautiful watch. That was a disaster of a buy. I can also tell that if I buy another watch that complements one of my favorite watches, it actually doesn't replace it. It often supplements the usage. Buying something that is radically different from what I usually, like, often doesn't work out as well. I've got space for 1 to 2 of what I'd consider quirky watches. More than that, and most of them will never ever get worn after a year. I kind of default to 1 or 2 of those quirky watches, and that's more than enough for me. And the other thing I know I'm clearly obsessed about with watches, and I'm insane for having an Excel sheet, but I really hope you enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe. Cheers.